welcome to those of you here. Today's part of the research seminar series at IBEI. The presentation today will be by Mathijs van Leeuwen about the politics and depoliticization of pro-poor land tenure registration in conflict-affected settings. Mathijs is the associate professor at the Radboud Universiteit in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. He works since 2009 at the Center for International Conflict Analysis and Management, and is trained as a development sociologist, so he specialized a lot in conflict, peace-building development countries. So currently works a lot on issues like today's presentation, and on like land disputes, post-conflict land reforms, local peace building, these issues. And today's presentation is also part of a larger project which is called, connected to these issues, which is called Securing Tenure, Sustainable Peace, the Challenges of Localizing Land Registration in Conflict-Affected Burundi in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. Okay, Mathijs, fire away. The process is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me here in this seminar series. Even if there's not so many people, I'm very happy to talk to you and eager to tell my story. So don't hesitate to join the discussion, and if you have questions later onwards, to approach me. I think Martijn did a very nice job in introducing me and telling me a bit about my background. Maybe it's good to say that I'm a rural development sociologist by background. I started at Wageningen University, and there I also did a PhD in Wageningen Disaster Studies, as it was called at the time, which was focusing on discourses and practices of civil society peace building. And in that project, I encountered that much of the work that local peace building organizations in conflict affected settings were working on were land issues. So that's why after my PhD, I decided to gradually shift my focus and work more on that topic, although I still work on issues of local peace building. But I think the land arena and land reform in post-conflict settings is a very nice topic to also explore the dynamics of post-conflict transformation. Over the past few years, I've been involved in a series of larger projects which are represented here, and also some others. Many of them are a spin-off of grounding land governance, including the actual one that focused on land reform in the Great Lakes region of Africa. So most of my work still focuses on that particular area. So also the Securing Tenure Sustainable Peace thing. Today I'm going to talk, indeed, as you said already, largely about findings from this particular project, but I'm going to intersperse them with ideas and findings from those other projects as well, I think. What is this project all about? Well, it's about tenure security. Maybe for you, those of you that are not familiar with the term, tenure security is basically about the extent to which people feel secure and have reasonable confidence not to be arbitrarily deprived of the land rights enjoyed or the economic benefits deriving from them. And I think it's important to take into account when we talk about tenure security. Of course, this is about legal rights, this is about property titles, but this is also about access and the extent to which rights of people are in daily life acknowledged by other members in the community, for instance, or even by their government. Tenure security has become a very high on the list of those concerned about post-conflict settings, for the fact that in many conflict-affected environments there are many disputes around land. Due to displacement and temporary return, properties of land have been reshuffled. Some of those properties have been returned to the original owners, but in some instances people are still away or have returned and can no longer identify their properties. At the same time, land governing authorities are in disarray and find it very difficult to deal with those disputes. So for that reason, securing land tenure or providing to secure tenure has become an essential element of the post-conflict peace building agenda to contribute to a recovery of livelihoods, to assure peace and stability and prevent those conflicts around land from occurring, and also to contribute to livelihoods and sustainable development in the future. And this is also seen in sub-Saharan Africa, where I conducted most of my research projects. And in the past, while there was a lot of focus in those projects on the state, strengthening, for instance, the cadastre, over time, attention shifted more towards customary and local practices of land registration, out of awareness of the failures of state-led state formalization, which often failed to take account of the most vulnerable people, take account of women, for instance. But at the same time, there are still many questions about the effectiveness of those more localized or customary forms of contributing to local land tenure. And those have, of course, to do with risks related to maybe elite capture, but there are also questions that still remain about the extent to which women's rights are still being taken into account in such kind of localized efforts for land registration. And then when we talk about localized land registration, it's maybe good to mention that it's often contrasted with formalization, with the cadastre, and the cadastre, of course, is often located in the capital, far away from the areas where people suffer insecurity. So the notion from localizing land registration is that you bring this registration to community level through often a very simple procedure of getting the registration process starting, which takes fully place at the local level, which is accessible to all people in the community, and which ideally should also contribute to preventing those kinds of injustices against women or poor people in the community. But still, there are lots of questions about those new modalities for securing land tenure, especially in post-conflict situations. And that is precisely what our research project, Securing Tenure Sustainable Peace, is all about. We try to investigate how those localized efforts for registering land tenure work out and deal with the dynamics that are very particular for post-conflict settings. Ongoing migration, ongoing displacement of people, weakened authorities, erosion of both statutory and customary authorities to deal with land issues. And we try to figure out how do those new modalities of land registration work out in those particular settings. And today I will discuss some work that, well, in fact, this paper is about to appear, Promoting Land Tenure Security for Sustainable Peace, Lessons on the Politics of Transformation. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our findings from our research, focusing on the politics of land tenure registration, and notably the failure to take those into account in many of those intervention programs. And we emphasize in the paper that I refer to here on the slide through three types of politicization and de-politicization, namely in the kind of discourses that legitimize those kinds of interventions, the ongoing political competition around the implementation of those programs, and the politics involves in the outcomes, the kind of risks and unpredicted consequences of land tenure registration programs. But I will illustrate that, as I said, with some other examples that are not included in this particular paper. I think it's maybe important to mention also that we really rely a lot on the notions of claim making and everyday politics. Everyday politics is basically about, you could contrast it to the kind of larger politics that involve positions of authority, the state actors. We assume that also local authorities, non-state institutions, and local community members themselves are fully part of those everyday politics. They have their own agendas, their own interests, and try to find ways to promote their agendas. And in that connection, we also focus on claim making. While land tenure security literature often emphasizes property rights, the notion of property rights and access is often very static. And what we like to emphasize is we need a notion that illustrates how people use those rights and make those rights work for them, and the kind of tactics and repertoires and pathways they find to get their claims to land acknowledged. So much about our theoretical angle. If you are interested in more of that, we can of course discuss, but I'm not going to delve into that today. First of all, we think there's important politics involved that are often forgotten when it comes to the discourses that legitimize land tenure registration. I already mentioned that many intervening organizations emphasize this enormous need to take account of land tenure insecurity in conflict-affected setting for reasons of stability, fearing that those land disputes might evolve into a new producer of instability and insecurity, but also emphasizing that for the recovery of livelihoods, it's so very essential that people have secure access to land, and that in order to entice people to invest in their land, they have to have security about ownership of that land. We, to some extent, agree with the urgency of this issue, but at the same time, we emphasize and we concur with authors like Jonathan Goodhand, Séverine Autesserre, who argue the need to politicize and re-infuse the debate about peace building and post-conflict recovery with politics. And in that I resonate earlier thinking in the 1990s, probably, well, you might be aware of the work of Ferguson on the anti-politics machine, in which he analyzes how development interventions tend to reframe development as a kind of a technical issue, forgetting about all kinds of politics involved. And I think David Mosse is also an example of this kind of thinking, and that is increasingly taken up in peace building and post-conflict literature. And we see this kind of processes of depoliticization also happening in the land tenure arena. There's a lot of talking about this urgent need for intervention. There's a lot of talking about weak local institutions, unproductive land use, a kind of a need for modernization that make it almost self-evident that tenure registration takes place. In this, there's a lot of emphasis on the tools for registration, a lot of emphasis on pro-poor mechanisms. Well, there's all kinds of tools available on the market. If you search the internet, you will encounter many of them that will facilitate this process of registration. But what the problem is with most of those tools is that they are all about boundary delimitation. And what we observe in our research projects is, well, that's all very nice. Of course, it's helpful to know the demarcations, the precise boundaries. But what is in most conflict-affected settings precisely the problem is not so much the boundaries. It's about the rights. Who owns the rights on this particular property? And that is not going to be solved, that question, by technical tools. Many of the deadliest disputes, for instance, in southwestern Uganda, where I conducted fieldwork myself, also in Burundi, where Burundian PhD students is conducting fieldwork now, are within families, are between brothers. In southwestern Uganda, at a police station, they would tell you, well, it's almost always brothers that are involved in killings around land, killing one each other, or women that fall out at the moment the inheritance is distributed. While many of those discourses on land tenure registration focus on outsiders that come to those communities or neighbors, but well, in many cases it's actually within the family. And also, what is happening is many of those land tenure registrations is that the focus on the responsibility of managing this registration system is kind of introduced and is kind of embedded in local state structures. Well, in many of the settings where people experience tenure insecurity, it's precisely the state that is responsible for tenure insecurity. For instance, in southwestern Uganda, it was largely the state that was responsible for grabbing people's land, or at least it was what people experienced. And then, of course, well, now I'm kind of disqualifying the state in this. Often, it's not just the land of people that is insecure, it's also the land of the state. Land that has been reserved for development purposes, for the constructions of schools, etc. As a result of registration programs, it's not assured that that is taken into account. I remember the case of Burundi, where an inventory was being done of state-held lands in the beginning of the new millennium, and 1 year later, large part of that inventory, the land in that inventory, had already been misappropriated by individuals, state officials that came through the study aware of available land and acquired that land in that way. Let me see. What just another illustration of this focus on the needs, the technicalities of securing tenure comes from Eastern Congo, where there is indeed a high frequency and high incidence of tenure insecurity and related disputes. And a lot of intervening organizations have come to focus on the mediation, resolving those disputes, providing access to justice for those competing parties in a conflict that do not manage to arrive at a solution, and land registration as a kind of a prevention for future conflicts to emerge, but also to deal with ongoing conflicts. And what we found when looking at those mediation and land registration initiatives, what is very what becomes obvious is that those land disputes are not all, of course, and this might sound self-evident, but unfortunately this is how it goes in the land tenure arena, I would say. Many of those land disputes are not directly related to conflict. No, they need to be seen in a larger conflict of unfair land and labor relationships, especially what is very prevalent is patronage politics, which over the period since the colonial times assured that large quantities of land, for instance, the one that you see here on the right-hand side, got into the hands of representatives from the government. And at the same time, that put a lot of pressure on the plots outside those properties, and increasingly that became increasingly little. People residing on those lands were not properly protected by the state, because the state only acknowledged state land and customary land, which was the responsibility of customary authorities. And you could only access customary land if you belonged to an ethnic group, a kind of community that was acknowledged as that. So many people, for instance, that came over history already for centuries from Rwanda and settled in Eastern Congo, still continued to talk their own language, Kinyarwanda. They couldn't get access to those lands. Well, that complicated matters and was one of the reasons even why in the beginning of the 90s it was so easy for rebel groups to mobilize support. On the one hand, those people that had been those Kinyarwanda speakers that had in the meantime in fizzy ways acquired access to land, and on the other hand, people that claimed to be local residents of the area, and that's discriminated against those Kinyarwanda speakers, but also accused them of being behind land grabbing in the region. And then a final very important dynamic, I would say, is what we call a crisis of plantation agriculture. In some of those regions, more than 40% of the land, am I right, maybe even more than 60% of the land is in the hands of plantation owners. And many of those plantations in the past produced coffee, pyrethrum, tea, other kinds of export crops, and provided labor, provided livelihoods to people in the surrounding communities. But due to economic crisis, and then also due to the war and a collapse of the economy, damage done to the processing facilities on those plantations, jobs were lost. And the new owners of those plantations, which in the meantime, during the war, acquired those lands often in a very irregular way, the new plantations owners didn't resort back to production for the market, but decided to keep cattle. And for that, they only would need maybe 2 or 3 boys that could herd cows on large extended spaces of land like those, adding to the pressure on those lands. And we have investigated a number of disputes and how mediation and land registration worked out in those cases. And what we encountered was a lot of dissatisfaction, because people had the feeling, well, this mediation is so very nice because it keeps the peace for the moment, but it is not addressing the major issue that is threatening us, this kind of unjust way in which the agricultural economy is organized, which doesn't provide us with jobs, which doesn't provide us with land. And then land registration and mediation is just a kind of a window dressing, or even kind of adding insult upon injury. Because the moment that people start to complain, then we have reports of NGOs and intervening organizations then saying, hey, look, we try to help those people, we settled their disputes, and now they are still complaining. Well, what can we do else? And that is, I think, a very nice example, or telling example of this need to take justice concerns and this kind of the politics, the political economy of land and its distribution into account when taking account of land registration. Let's go to the next topic, because I also noticed my time is limited, and I can imagine that you have other jobs to do or other tasks ahead of you. What we also see is a lot of power politics around actual land tenure reforms. There is, for instance, work by Ambrina Manji, who writes how land tenure reforms provide a very beautiful opportunity for all kinds of state representatives, but also the surveying community, those in charge of designing tools to implement land registration programs, to forward their own agendas. You could even say that it counts for NGOs working on land tenure issues. Think, for instance, from Burundi, we heard several reports in which NGO staff actively used land tenure reform programs, the insights they acquired due to the fact that they were working for an NGO, to also acquire land from the local authorities in the communities where they were working, for instance. We emphasize a lot how land tenure, or we explore indeed how land tenure reforms may feed in those kinds of politics, but we also emphasize that, well, there's more than this kind of a political economy. And there we are inspired by thinking in terms of institutional multiplicity and legal anthropology, that emphasizes how in settings where there's different institutions in charge at the same time, in situations of insecurity, you will often see a kind of a coming up of competition between those different institutions about who is responsible for what kind of rules apply, what kind of regulations apply. And that's particularly the case, of course, in those post-conflict settings. And that's what we also see around the issue of land. Intensified competition between customary and statutory institutions, for instance. And both of those institutions, or representatives of those institutions, try to bend newly established legislation and newly established institutions to their own advantage, but not just for their personal gain, but also for contributing to the standing of that authority, trying to gain legitimacy for customary ways of managing land, or trying to contribute to the standing and legitimacy of the state in their community. And in some of our work, we identify how this kind of practices effectively contributes to what you could call local state formation, how through land reforms, state officials or representatives of the state manage to imbue the state with meaning and replant and reinstall in the state in rural communities. Again, I could provide you with many different examples of that. I think just the case of Uganda is illustrative, where, for instance, there was a lot of competition between customary and statutory institutions. The state acknowledged customary tenure but at the same time, in its wording, in its behavior, tended to disqualify customary tenure, making all kinds of statements about how custom failed to take account of women. But also, while customary tenure was integrated into this localized tenure registration, in the end, what we often saw happening due to this competition between institutions at the local level, the state kind of won the battle, because even customary leaders that were included, or state representatives that were included in land management systems at the local level, they were kind of thinking about, hey, what will happen if we take this decision in this case? And one of the parties will proceed to the state court, what will happen to our judgment? But it works two ways. In some instances, it supported the state. In other instances, it also supported custom, because then those customary leaders, well, not just customary leaders, but those local leaders in those land managing councils would consider, hey, maybe we better take account of our customary regulations, because what we need is that people accept our decision. And for that reason, even if state legislation would say, well, in this particular case, land should be equally distributed between brothers and sisters, those localized tenure registration systems would still favor the brothers in those kinds of cases. I think this is a very important element also to take. Oh, sorry. I have to. It's sometimes a bit difficult to shift between the slides. I think this is a very important topic to take into account for organizations working in those kinds of settings, and how to deal with those dynamics of institutional multiplicity and competition. And what we, for instance, in northern Uganda observed was how effectively intervention strongly feeds into the legitimacy of both state and customary institutions, both state and customary rules and norms, and might have very significant effect. But that intervening organizations should be more aware of how they influence the institutional setup and institutional roles and responsibilities. I think it has to do with the division of roles and responsibilities, for instance. What we saw in northern Uganda is how support by NGOs to the state contributed to the legitimacy of the state, precisely by providing them with vehicles, providing them with the tools to be capable of doing land administration. But also, to a certain extent, what was very fascinating, the system that was being used and promoted was certificates of customary ownership. So that suggested taking account of customary ownership regulations and access mechanisms. But eventually, it were state responsibles that were responsible for the implementation of that system. It has to do a lot with the practices and modes of governance. For instance, people in the communities observed changes in institutional culture. Suddenly, officials from the land administration department being there in the office when they came, when you made an appointment, they would be sitting there waiting for you. Use of new technology, this all contributed to the standing of this institution. But of course, it also relates a lot to the kind of notions that are being propagated, and kind of notions about gender, and to what extent outside origins coming from outside propagate a certain vision, for instance, on gender, and the extent to which this resonates in local communities. And what we saw especially in northern Uganda, was that in most cases customary institutions were kind of sidelined, and even youngsters that had gained access through decentralized administration, through local elections, were not taken very seriously in many of those registration programs, precisely because on the title of the certificate of customary, on the certificate of customary ownership, there was only space for mentioning one name. Well, luckily enough, as a result of partly as a result of our project, this was also later changed in this program. This brings us finally to the politics of outcomes, and that's more in terms of the kind of unexpected consequences of programs, the kind of unexpected risks related to land registration. A very familiar one is the commodification and monetization of land access due to registration processes. Land is no longer being considered as part of the customary domain, but becomes perceived as an individual property about which the head of the family, often the male, the man, can take personal decisions rather than it's the extended family that is in charge of the land. But there's also a lot of questions about, does it indeed result in a reduction of disputes? And we have seen in the literature there is different opinions on this. In our own work, we also noticed that there's often an increase of disputes, precisely due to the fact that a registration exercise has started in the community. People start to realize, hey, this is the moment, this is a defining moment. We have to be very careful to assure that our land is registered and taken into account. And of course, it's also shortly after disputes that there are still a lot of unclarity about who still survived, who is still residing in these refugee camps. And then if you then start with the registration exercise, you run the risk that you have registered and demarcated a certain property to find out only later that people that also hold a claim on that property still have to return from refuge. An important one is also the increasing readability of land resources, the extent to which, as a result of those exercises, the land actively or is perceived to get access to information on the land. And that was particularly in northern Uganda, one of the challenges of land registration programs, that people had a lot of suspicion about the state and the registration exercise, which is being perceived as eventually contributing to providing a basis on which to raise taxes. And a very important, and I think that's the final one, and I will give you some examples of that, and then I will go to my conclusions. The very important fact that in many of those local settings, in conflict-affected settings, what you see happening is a kind of an articulation between local land disputes and higher level political competition. I think I already mentioned some of the examples of this from Burundi. What you see happening in many conflict-affected settings is that, of course, land disputes at one time, they might be an independent, they might be a very particular dynamic of a conflict-affected setting. But at kind of crucial moments, they tend to relate to higher level ethno-political contestation. And that's is what we, for instance, noticed in Burundi when I, for the first time, conducted field research myself over there that was in 2004. At a local level, the reintegration of returning refugees from Tanzania went relatively smoothly. And ethnic peers, Hutu and Tutsi, would share the land or find kind of compromises at the local level. The culprit in those cases was the local administration, which was being perceived as unjust and unfair, and people kind of bounded together against their authorities. When Rosina Chachua, he's a lady who was a PhD student in this project, conducted research like 5 or 6 years later, the situation had drastically changed. Because then there was a different government in power that basically run an agenda of ethnic integration, but increasingly came to be predisposed towards the Hutu, towards the returning refugees. So when land disputes occurred in the communities, what political leaders would do in those communities, what they would favor, as long as they depended on the CND FTD, they would favor the Hutu returnees. And then that way, the local disputes kind of got articulated and got connected to those higher level disputes between ethno-political leaders in the country, making, of course, the land registration process a very risky exercise in which some of those organizations involved in this really had to struggle, to the point that Rosine found it very dangerous to travel to the communities because she knew that people knew that she was conducting research on this very topic and that there was so much political mobilization going on around localized land disputes. For convenience, I will leave out the case of South Sudan, although it's a very interesting case, but it's a beautiful example of this articulation. And now we come to my conclusions. In my talk, I have emphasized different ways in which issues around land tenure registration get politicized. And I have emphasized the need also for intervening organizations to be more aware of those politics involved in land tenure registration. I would like to make very clear that I'm not against land tenure registration. I think it's important for people in conflict-affected standings, in poor communities, to get security about their assets. At the same time, I think programs working on securing tenure have to be very careful about those kinds of politics that I illustrated in my story, the kind of politics involved in the discourses, legitimizing intervention, the failure to take into account wider issues of justice, for instance, into account, the failure to take into account the issue of rights rather than boundary demarcation and the technicalities of land registration exercises, the ongoing competition around those programs, how land registration becomes one of the reform programs that facilitates institutional competition, for instance, between statutory and customary authorities to manifest themselves and establish legitimacy in their communities. And finally, the politics involved in the outcomes of those programs, many of which are kind of unexpected. And I think, well, maybe the slides include some illustrations of ZOA, a Dutch organization working a lot on land registration in Burundi. Well, they have tried to take some of those lessons into account and now are spreading them on the leaflets that they provide to the local NGOs they are working with. More or less, that was what I wanted to tell you. I hope that you have become a bit more aware of the politics and depoliticization of localizing land registration, and I'm very much looking forward to any questions and concerns that you might have.
Thank you very much. Okay, my video again. Thank you much for this very interesting talk. I think it was very illuminating about this topic and also about the different dimensions to take into consideration. So I've only some brief comments or more, and then we open the floor. I heard already Bishado wants to ask a question, so I'll make perhaps 2 or 3 quick comments, and then I open the floor. Okay. We have only 2 or 3 quick questions. So perhaps you could elaborate first. So I'm going through these 3 points you mentioned. So you first talked a little bit, also in the text you sent me beforehand, that we should also take into consideration that that this idea, discourse, that many of these measures are rather technical solutions, and you make the argument there that well, what is real technical? That almost also these approaches that are often promoted as technical solutions are the results of political disputes or political processes and political choices. So my first question would be, if you could perhaps a little bit more elaborate also, or from where these technical discourses come from, if they are something come from the international donor community, which is part of a more neoliberal mindset, also to getting more stable and land tenure rights, to make it also easier to sell land, especially in the context of transnational, international land acquisitions. So if you could talk a little bit about this, that would be my first question. And the second one would be, talked also a little bit about these customary law. I mean, there's of course an issue. We see many of these post-conflict contexts that we see different law systems working at the same time. It's explained the state law and customary law in some cases. I think in the case you discussed, not in other places of the world, also religious law. So to what extent do you think that the strength of the state also conditions the outcomes? I mean, you looked here, you explained already some countries, but I assume that in Uganda, the state is stronger overall, at least it would be my assumption, than, for example, in Eastern DNC. So to what extent you really could observe that the strength and of the presence of the state also influences the outcomes of what legal system, what form of land tenure system eventually became more dominant. No? And then a question I had about the third aspect. So as you said, you mentioned many of these unintended consequences, and also said, well, as you mentioned one point, well, sometimes these plans, while well-intended, they may things even make worse because they have this simmering conflicts. Then they become even more important for the people there. So my question would be, what's in your opinion, what is the best moment to do these things? Is it better to really wait until there's a certain stability, or is there, if you wait too long, then is a higher likelihood that the entire conflict will re-emerge because of this uncertainty? So what is the best moment to start with these things in a post-conflict context? Okay. So that would be my questions. That there was already one person, but I'm not sure. But what do you prefer, to answer these first, or I ask already the audience?
Yeah, what do you prefer? How do you organize this normally? I think I can say just a few things, and maybe that raises again new questions. So
yeah, let's do it like this. Yeah.
Where does this technical discourse come from? That's what you started with. Well, of course, I think to some extent I illustrated a bit. Well, there is this kind of felt urgency in many post-conflict settings that this is an issue that is posing a significant threat for security in the short run, and poses serious threats also for recovery in the long term. So there is this urgency that we need to do something, and we do need to do it now, because otherwise we will have unsurmountable problems in the future. So there's this urgency. There's definitely also this kind of a neoliberal discourse which plays a role. Of course, the beginning of the new millennium, there was a lot of talking about land as that capital, the argument from Hernando de Soto, South American economist, who emphasized, well, we have to bring value to the property that poor people have, and we can achieve that by doing land registration programs, because in that way they can bring the assets to serve the purpose and get a collateral and use them as a collateral for a loan. I would have to say that many of even an organization like the World Bank is kind of increasingly overcoming those notions. I mean, they are not kind of taking the Soto just as a self-evident claim, and they are also increasingly aware of the benefits that, for instance, customary and local institutions might have. But still, definitely this notion that you have to secure land ownership in order to make it economically beneficial is still very strong. And then I think what is also important here is that there is not so much a complicity of kinds of neoliberal interveners. To a certain extent, it's also the background of those organizations. What we noticed, for instance, in Burundi, is that many of the staff, also of local NGOs, are lawyers by background, so they tend to think in legal terms. So when they talk about land disputes, a legal solution is the kind of response they have in mind, a hammer in search of a nail to hit on, so to say. When it comes to your customary and state, is this division between those two? You suggest that it might be that in settings where the state is much stronger, there is less place for custom, and this discussion might be less intense. I'm not entirely sure about it. I think in most post-conflict settings, indeed, there is a lot of debate and discussion between those institutions, because, of course, the state needs to re-establish itself, but lacks capacity, lacks strength, etc. That certainly also counts in the northern part of Uganda, but it counts as well for customary institutions that are ways to re-establish themselves and try to regain the power they might have lost in the past. What we found very fascinating, especially in Uganda, but also in Southern Sudan to see, is that state presence is not a kind of a prerequisite for this. In my own work in South Sudan, what we noticed was that the state was very effective in spreading itself in its own absence. It was like the legislation and the kind of modalities that it established for land registration and for managing land tended to favor state officials when it came to this kind of institutional competition. And what of course also played a role was the shifts in population in the area, that many people came from other areas into to the southern part of South Sudan, where we conducted our field research, and were much more supportive of the government and of state regulation because they benefited from that. And even if the state was hardly present, they still managed to gain strength. And the same in southwest Uganda, where what I found very fascinating to see is that this Ugandan state is commonly considered as a very strong and willing state. Yes, maybe in the capital and in the major urban hubs, not in the countryside, but you see there is even a kind of a withdrawing of the state and trying to search for ways of dodging responsibility, handing the responsibility for land governance, for instance, to local institutions. And local dignitaries use that because they see this void and they notice, hey, I can present myself here as if I am the state, and by that gain legitimacy in my community. So even while resources are dwindling, are going down as a result of the decentralization, there's more money taken away from the communities than there is actually going, still the state is able to establish itself. Best way to do those things, well, I think it's really a very important one is of course custom made. I think if you think of tenure security, of securing tenure, what you need to better understand is what is the nature of tenure insecurity that is being well dealt with in the community. In southwestern Uganda, but also in Burundi, there are many places where local memory is still very strong, and people know precisely which property belongs to whom. There the question might be boundary demarcation. Think of better ways of identifying the boundaries between plots. The issue is not so much one of administration, because those people, they memorize who are the owners of specific plots. But in other settings that might be entirely different. There those local authorities might have lost their power, they might have disappeared, they might have been killed in the war, and there you really might need something entirely new, also because the setting is so unclear. So I would say, well, the main point would be something like custom made, but what that looks like in practice, of course, that is very difficult to predict and makes it also very difficult to implement those programs because it requires a diversified approach for each kind of setting.
Okay.
Is that more or less?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Well, I open the floor first also now for questions. There was already questions from Bisharo. Yeah, do you want to ask yourself?
Hi, my name is Bisharo. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. And I loved it because I actually worked with the Norwegian Refugee Council as an insular project officer, which I was in charge of actually housing, land and property rights. And it was our first, program. I mean, HLP started actually first in Somalia as a pilot project. So we kind of like, initiated it in the region. So a very interesting point. Everything that you're saying is really, out there. And my questions actually is related to one, the legal aspect of it. In Burundi and Uganda, as you've mentioned, we have this kind of customary and also statutory law that plays part in it. In Somalia is also a different case where we have legal pluralism, customary, statutory, and also Sharia law that plays together. And it has been challenging for us to, come up with suitable or sustainable solution into that, because you find out that they are all competing over each other, and everyone, all of them have the same roles, and especially people who lose are vulnerable people, especially IDPs, who have no land, and at the end of the day they just settle for whatever they're given, and people like international communities or NGOs come in to support, by providing temporary solution, like negotiating and mediating with these landowners. And as you know, Somalia, 60 or 70% of the land is not owned by the state, but it's owned by the private people who of course grabbed the land after the civil war. So mediating this, these landowners have already started having this kind of interest, because they know when they mediate, they can't give their land permanently. They give them temporary, they lease them for 5 years or 6 years. And their interest is to ensure that their land is used, for a certain period of time. And then when they need it to use for other things or commercial purposes, they evict these poor people. So it's a challenge. It's recurring, and these IDPs are never getting, sustainable solution. They're always evicted from one place to another, and they feel happy when they're giving this kind of occupancy land certificates, which are temporary at the end of the day. So my question is, how do you think we can find sustainable solution for that? Of course, incorporating all of these three, laws that are there. The second question is about housing, land and property, and women's rights. This is also a big issue, because in our context, we see that women are actually excluded, in some of these, property ownership, or they are not actually involved in any discussions in regards to this. And the reasons are many. And for example, even when a husband and a wife go to register for land documentation, the name of the husband is always there, so women are always left out. So this challenges. How do you think also that one, how can we go about that and ensure that women are actually empowered, and more so can be involved in this kind of exercising control over their land? Thank you.
Sharon, thank you very much for this question. It's a complex one, and I do not have an immediate answer ready for your case. But I think is in many post-conflict situations, it's very important is some kind of temporariness in the measures that are being taken. We have seen that in many conflict-affected settings, provide a kind of very fertile, a very good opportunity for land grabbing taking place. I think there's evidence for that for high diversity of cases, including northern Uganda, South Sudan, Burundi, well, virtually all the cases that we conducted research on. So what you need is some kind of acknowledgement of that fact, that might take place, and that you have some kind of, if legal measures are taken, and if land is to be redistributed, this should be on a kind of a rather semi rather than permanent basis, taking into account that always claims can be made in the future about the ownership of that land. So a certain temporality in the measures being taken. What I think is also very important is yeah, and that brings us to the issue of women's rights, and to this point of custom-made solutions to local settings. I think it's important when it comes to women's rights. The same problem that you sketch in Somalia counts for Burundi, counts for southwestern and in northern Uganda. Women have very little access to land on their own. They only access land via their male relatives. And that makes it very difficult for them to become independent landowners. What we have seen in Uganda is that programs that, for instance, try to empower women through giving them provisions in state legislation still might not solve that issue. As I sketched for the case of southwestern Uganda, where local land administrators purported to be acting on behalf of the state, but still considered customary mechanisms when it came to women's rights, because they were like, well, we have to legitimize ourselves in the community. We take those decisions in order to assure that people will accept them. Because otherwise, if we come with we enforce state legislation, people will nonetheless, they will still continue and proceed to the higher courts to contest our decision, and the dispute will not be solved. Well, of course, that's not a very sustainable solution. I think what is very important to consider as well is that within, but I'm not sure about Somalia, for northern Uganda and also for Burundi, it's clear that customary systems have certain mechanisms to protect women. And the question is, and the problem is that many of those are disregarded nowadays. Even in, for instance, in Burundi, in the past, it was common practice that a certain part of the inheritance would be reserved for women in case they would return after their marriage failed, so that they can still settle there and take care of their children. Some organizations in northern Uganda and Burundi say, well, that's maybe where we should work from. We should start from what is there and try to expand that and make those customary institutions more responsible for their traditional task of protecting women in the customary way. A very important aspect to take into account in that sense is also that both in Uganda and Burundi, the customary system is maybe not helping women much, but it's also women cannot access land on their own. But in fact, the same counts for men. The land belongs to the extended family, and the land is allocated to men for their lifetime to be handed over to the next generation, to the children if they die. And what we see sometimes happening in those kinds of renewal programs, those kinds of reform programs, is this kind of individualization. Rather than that families are mentioned on the land certificate, it's individuals, either men or even women, that are mentioned on the certificate. And the consequence is that it provides those individuals with a lot of freedom to sell their land, to acquire a loan from the bank. But at the same time, it also involves a lot of risks. It involves a lot of risk for the children, for the next generation. And I think it's very important for intervening organizations to kind of find a balance between those right holders, so to say, the current generation and the future one. And those are precisely the kind of things that you, as an intervener, you cannot decide that on your own. You have to engage in the dialogue with community members about what is it precisely that our land management system should stimulate. What is a kind of a fair way of assuring, a fair way of distributing the inheritance in the future. And then, of course, I think there is space in that for discussing rights of women and how to protect those. Is that kind of answering your question? Or?
Yes, please. Thank you.
So maybe a bit not a very straightforward answer, but the core of it, be more aware of the kinds of protection mechanisms that are locally present and search for opportunities for strengthening, enforcing, and maybe even changing those.
Are there more questions from the audience? Well, Emma, Jinjing. Oh, all clear, Emma.
Great.
Jinjin, do you have a question?
Yeah, actually, thanks for your wonderful presentation. I'm quite interested in the rural development in the developing countries. And when I saw your presentation, it seems like I'm seeing the China in the past 13 years like that. So it reminds me a question that do you think it is essential for the African countries to have a strong region or authority at first to help them get out the poverty? because I know the stable of agriculture, the stable environment is the basic rule or the bottom line for the industrial development. And if there's no stable outer environment or inner environment, nothing will be improved, I have to say. So for me, I think the first thing they need to solve is the conflicts between, but the reasons why they have so many conflicts may be because they don't have a stable government or stable region. Yeah.
Yeah, I think of course that would be very helpful. And at the same time, I think I concur with you that it's very important to see measures to strengthen tenure security in a context of larger reform programs for agricultural development. Like the case of Eastern Congo, it doesn't make sense to only focus on land registration and mediating disputes if you do not take into account wider questions about employment, wider questions about distribution of land. In that case, I think it's maybe a promising sign that over the last 2 years there seems to be some improvement on that side, and that the government is interested in considering, together with the donor community and NGOs, possibilities of revising legislation on plantation agriculture, which might hopefully contribute to reassessment of what those plantations will need to be used for in the future, and make them more productive again, provide livelihoods to people living in the surroundings. At the same time, we have to be very careful to expect too much, maybe again from government in that respect. And then I'm immediately thinking about the case of Rwanda, where the government has taken it upon itself to come up with a kind of a drastic revision of the agricultural production system in the country, and with dramatic speed is trying to reform the countryside, which is often not really in the interest of those disenfranchised communities that we have been referring to, and that tend to fall out in those kinds of reform and development exercises, and which even research from our colleagues from Leeuwen, La Neuve University, for instance, illustrated, who then again, injury or injustice upon injury are kind of reprimanded for failing to go along with those programs and not participating in that, even if as a result of those programs themselves they are kind of pushed out result adverse effects on their livelihoods. So I concur. Agriculture is not everything, and there is a need to provide and to think about how you can provide livelihoods outside agriculture in the long term. But be aware that for the current generation, this is most likely the only thing that is available. So you have to work on that as well. You cannot simply say we start industry and let's hope that people then find jobs in industry in 25-year times. No, they have to make a living now.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there more questions from the audience? All clear? Yeah. Then thank you very much for this very interesting talk. So I think we all learned a lot here, and I hope that you also got some interesting comments or some questions.
Okay.
Yeah, and then also I can quickly announce also the next talk. Here. Oh, sorry. So we have the next talk in 2 weeks again, and it will be about the global politics of bottled water by Raúl Pacheco Vega. So a very different topic again, but I hope that I'll see some of you again there. Thank you very much. And thank you to Mathijs.
Okay, thank you very much, and enjoy the remainder of the sessions.